Okay, hi everyone. So it's SmithyQ, SmithyQ.com. Welcome to the next installment of the opening survey. And so last time we looked at the King's Indian defense, in which black, you can see, puts his pawn on d6 here, and then it's going to very often lead to some type of situation like this, if you recall, in which there's interlocking pawn chains, and the black bishop is kind of buried behind there, and it's not necessarily the happiest piece on the board. And the play is much more in terms of pawns, in which black is trying to counterattack the pawn chain and or advance the pawns to attack the white king. And the pawns play an extremely important role, and it's generally pawn storms on both sides of the board, right? Where white's doing things like this, whereas black is doing, again, the exact same thing, I'll color it red, on this half of the board. Today we're going to be looking at something that starts the first few moves, but by playing d5 and entering what's known as the Grunfeld, it leads to a similar and yet not at all similar type of position. This bishop is very rarely blocked in behind its pawns, certainly much less often as in case of the King's Indian. It plays a very active role. And whereas the pawns were locked in the King's Indian, and most of the play is happening on the wings, the Grunfeld is very different, in which the center is not regularly blocked, and a lot of play happens in the center. And so it's very difficult to describe the entire Grunfeld, just like it's very difficult to describe the entire King's Indian in a general way. So I'm going to try and cover the main themes as best as I can, at least in the main variation. The main disadvantage of the Grunfeld is that it's so incredibly analyzed. There's so much theory involved because it's such a rich, interesting opening, which means playing it requires a certain amount of preparation. Now, some of the ideas I'm going to share, I'll be honest, when I was about 14 to 1600 range, I played the Grunfeld without really knowing any theory. And when I played other people that didn't know theory, it was fine. I got great games. When I started playing people who actually were booked up a little bit and they knew some lines, that's when I struggled a bit. And so, it's not really an opening you can play on general principles, but let's give it a shot anyway. Let's see what we can do. And so we're going to explore the main line, actually, because this highlights the themes the best, in which white's going to take on d5, he pushes e4, and he has the exchange. And if we were to just look at this, it looks like white has done an incredible amount. He's forced black to exchange a piece. He's got easy development for all of his pieces. He's got what looks like a very strong center. Black has no space. Like, isn't this just a great opening for white? And if that were the entire case, I'd be completely correct, and the Grunfeld would be put out of business. But it's not. Black is hoping to, okay, white has the center. Can he keep the center? Maybe black can counterattack it. And this is really the nature of the entire opening, is whether these center pawns are strong or if they're just a target. So let's look. We'll start actually with bishop g7. And so at first glance, it might look like the bishop is just staring at, this wall of pawns. And, it's not very good. But after c5, we can see what's happening here. White cannot play d5, the pawn is hanging. Similarly, white cannot just take the pawn is hanging. And so there's going to be an eventual exchange. In fact, let me just put that on the board here. Take. And now this pawn isn't so secure. We can see already black is attacking it with two pieces. It's very easy to attack it with another one. It's possible to perhaps move the queen away, bring a rook to the d file, then the rook's attacking it. Also, the bishop can come to g5, pinning, threatening to take one of the defenders. And so this is perhaps the main black idea, is to take his pieces and pressure the center, and either win a pawn or to force some sort of concession, where white is stuck defending very, very passively. And then black is able to coordinate his pieces and do some other things as well. That's the absolute dream position for black, and that's the idea. And this is the idea that I think is the easiest to understand, is there's a pawn there, take all of your pieces and just attack it. And so notice how we start with c5, and then we pile up pressure. And this is the main idea in the Grunfeld, or at least one of them. I think this is easy to understand, and at a certain level, you can play fairly well just by this. The problem is that there is an equally important part of the Grunfeld, which is much harder to understand, and that is playing around the pawns. And I think that's easiest with an example. So let me just zoom ahead. Notice how in this line, white will often put his knight on e2, just so that way if there ever is a bishop g4, you can play f3, look, we're supporting the center, we're breaking the pin, right? There is no pin, nope, and the bishop has to move again. So very, very common. Instead, we'll get knight c6. Let's look right here, actually. One idea is what happens if white plays this? d5. Because now the knight's defending the pawn, everything looks okay, it looks like we're kicking the knight away. And this is what I'm referring to as playing around the pawns. If white can successfully advance these pawns and kick black back, then yeah, white's just doing great. He's going to have a space advantage, everything is awesome. It's usually not that simple, or you have to be extremely careful. And this is an example of what could go wrong. Sure, you kick the knight, but it comes to e5, and that's actually a better square. It's hitting our bishop. Let's say the bishop moves. All right, black plays b6. So now everything is protected. And notice how the bishop is now staring at a pawn. Bishop isn't doing very much. It's not easy to advance the pawn further. And if white tries to kick this knight out of the board, because again, that knight is probably the best piece right now, it's amazing how fast things can go wrong for white. With f4. Okay, knight g4, attack the bishop. If you try and save the bishop, well now, all of a sudden tactics start appearing. Look at this, c4. If you take it, queen to c7. Hitting the bishop, which is undefended, also x-raying down into the pawn. Bishop moves, say, all of a sudden queen c5, and look! The pawns have moved, and that's left all these weaknesses behind the board. We're actually threatening mate. And you could see, you could just imagine something like rook f1. All right, let's take the pawn. Rook moves back. We come right back. Rook comes in here. And now e6, threatening to blow up the center, opening lines up while the king is still stuck. We can see the problem is that white has advanced his pawns too far, and black's been able to play around it. Look at this. This knight cannot be kicked back by a pawn. This queen, it can't be kicked back by a pawn. And this very important diagonal cannot be closed. This diagonal, very, very open. And white would love to be able to close it by eventually playing something like e5, but of course it's not working. Pawns are hanging, things are exploding, things aren't very good right now. White has advanced his pawns too fast and too carelessly in this example. So this is an example, again, of playing around the pawns. And this is much more subtle and requires more, it basically requires you to be a better player, basically. When I tried to play the Grunfeld at the 14 to 1600 range, I couldn't really do this very well. Because again, white all of a sudden, you know, we're getting these tactics with c4 and then moving the queen and trying to find the space. That's not easy, especially if you haven't actually studied the theory or any of these ideas before. It's very hard to just make it up on the spot. And that was my main problem. And this is, again, what I find to be the hardest part of the Grunfeld. Playing around the pawns. Let's look at another example. We'll just go a bit further so that way it's less of a mistake from white. So let's have both sides complete development. Take, take. Usually black will play knight a5 to kick the bishop back. Let's just say b6. And now here, white generally has, okay, white has a whole bunch of ideas, but there's three general ideas. We have ideas with the idea of playing, for instance, d5. We have the idea of e5, and we have the idea of just, say, keeping the tension. Maybe, you know, rook c1. So let's look at them all. d5 is an extremely common idea, because again, we're using the center. Of course, right now, we're giving up the exchange. That isn't actually that bad. It's not as if we're just down material, because again, the queen is on a beautiful diagonal, and this bishop is ready to come in. And if black wants to keep his material, he needs to play f6. And so black is up material, yay, that's great. But again, position's a little bit weakened. We can imagine pawns suddenly marching forward very quickly. And black's current pieces aren't in a very good position to take advantage of any of the weaknesses in white's camp. Also, before, when we looked at the previous variation, white's king was in the center, and so opening the center up was helping black. Here, both sides have castled, but there's much more weaknesses around the black king. And so if black opens the position up, it's liable that he's just weakening his king, so that's not very good. At the same time, he's up material. And so we can see that there's a huge imbalance in this position. Can black survive and hang on to his extra material? Or is white going to grow this initiative enough, start attacking, win back the material, or even checkmate? This is one possibility that's always open. So white could always think about sacrificing the exchange. Because if black doesn't take it, then he's just, advanced the pawns, and white's, got a risk-free, space advantage. There's another possibility, and that'd be the idea of trying to play not d5, but with the other pawn, e5. This one is very common, I found, again, at that amateur level, because people are obsessed with that bishop, trying to lock that bishop in. The thing is, two things. One, by advancing this pawn, it makes it very hard to advance this pawn. Because if you ever try and push with d5, well, now all of a sudden that pawn's hanging, so that's not very good. And so that means by playing e5, you either need to get f4 in very quickly, or you're kind of stuck playing around these pawns here. And after something like bishop to b7, we can see how, okay, you stop this bishop, now this bishop's doing very well. Also, there's always these f6 ideas of just opening the position up. You can imagine, take, take. Well, now the bishop's alive, and you've got an isolated pawn. This bishop is great. White center has disappeared. Of course, both sides have isolated pawn. Both sides have wide open bishops. I'm not saying either is better or worse at this position. Maybe white's got, a nominal advantage because he's white, but it's a game, and that e5 push didn't seem to help very much. Very common idea among amateurs is trying to play with this e6, but this is generally a mistake, more often than not. Sorry. Black has several ideas that he can do here, including just playing f5 and keeping the bishop back in the game, playing, queen d6, bishop d6, or bishop goes to d5, corralling that pawn, and if he plays f5, the rook will always come in, and the pawn is likely advanced a little bit too far. This is the main thing that amateur white that appears to be the main white mistake, is advancing the pawns too far, into the point where it's not actually cramping black, it's just giving black those targets. So that's e5. And then there's also the possibility of just keeping the tension. For instance, rook c1, let's just look at, bishop b7, and now playing d5. Say, white could, do some other things as well, prepare it more, but this is certainly possible, because now there is no exchange sacrifice, so that's great. And it's also blunting this bishop, which is fantastic. Whoops, don't play that move. At the same time, the exact same idea is possible there, is an eventual e6 is going to open things up, and there's going to be some pawn exchanges, which means this bishop will come back into the game. It's also, you can imagine, some exchanges on the c-file is going to go on. In fact, this is almost certainly going to be black's next move. I'll just put it on the board. And something interesting has happened is that if black is able to start exchanging pieces, then again, he can, play around some of these weak squares around the center. Also possible is to move this bishop at some point and then reroute the knight here. Getting a knight to d6 is extremely useful at times. And we're playing around. In this exact position, I'm thinking white's doing pretty okay, but there's a lot of play. And it's so easy for one side or the other to mess up by pushing pawns too fast, and again letting black get that counterplay behind it, or white doesn't push his pawns fast enough. Black is able to completely consolidate, chip away at the center. It's a struggle. It's really rich positions, which, again, is where the better player wins. And that's it. And this, again, it's something in which it's really hard to just play on these general ideas, these general plans, general principles, because often playing d5 is very, very useful. Sometimes it's very, very bad. Sometimes it completely kills black's play. Sometimes it gives black all the play in the world. Sure, it stops one bishop. It allows the other bishop to come in. Sometimes this bishop is even just so. There's so much going on. So it is not really an opening in which, again, you can just play on principles. However, if you keep these ideas in mind, in which black's main idea, or the main plan, is to play, again, almost always c5. It's very hard to play the Grunfeld without playing c5, because, again, c5 is what allows the bishop to live. It's what starts chipping away the pawns. But then after we play c5, the ideas are either to, let's see, do I still have the arrows? Yeah. To gang up and win the pawn, which is great, easy to understand. Or, right, is these ideas of playing around the pawn, specifically the pawn center, trying to lure it forward and then either chip it back. Again, after, even here, there's ideas. Maybe black can play f5 after an exchange, weakening that pawn, getting the bishop out, opening the f-file. That's possible. Again, playing e6, opening the center. We saw that. Having the pieces come around. Maybe ideas like queen a5, combining with the, maybe not in this exact position, but pressuring with the rest of the black pieces. These are ideas. And it requires a certain amount of experience, it requires a lot of calculation, and it requires a lot of familiarity with the positions. And all of this is only in this one variation, this one main line. And there are several other variations of the Grunfeld, but they generally play around this same sort of theme of where you're trying to play c5, you almost always play c5, and then you're either hitting the center directly or trying to coax that center forward and then playing around it. If that interests you, then by all means take up these positions. At the same time, if you were to look at, that last position we got to, which white plays d5, and you're thinking, black looks terrible, I have no idea why you want to have less space like this, then this is not the opening for you, because you're going to get to positions like this. Also be aware, I didn't really cover it, besides the exchange sacrifice, but there are ideas of white advancing the pawns, of keeping his center nice and safe, and then advancing pawns, and then attacking black. And so there is this aggressive element into the opening as well, or there can be, at least. So again, if that doesn't tickle your fancy at all, this is not the opening for you. But if you're thinking, wow, this piece play, it's very active against 1d4, very different from the King's Indian. It's very easy for black to get active play, especially if white makes some tiny mistakes. All of a sudden, black takes over the initiative. Endgames can also favor black, just because there's this 2-to-1 pawn majority on the queen side. Especially if you can win this pawn. If you can ever end up winning this pawn and just have two connected outside pass pawns, often the endgames are extremely good. Also, the white center. White has a space advantage, but it's one of those things, if you start trading a lot of pieces, a space advantage can become a liability. Or it can be a huge strength. So there's so much going on in these positions. I love them. I think they're really interesting. If I had more time to actually learn some theory, I would play this a heck of a lot more. Certainly a rich opening, and the games can be absolutely fantastic. Perhaps not the most beginner opening, but again, before you invest any time into this opening, you need to ask yourself, can I play a position like this as black? Is this okay? Something like it. Am I okay with that? If you are, maybe you have an opening for you. That's it. Again, there's like 6,000 other variations, but we're not going to touch that. Again, it's not a theory video, it's an idea video. But I think that's going to be it. So comments, questions, let me know. We're going to try and move on and cover as many openings as I can before Monday when I'm back in class. So that's that. So thanks for watching, everyone. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.